Okay. Well, let me welcome you all to this latest iteration of Dialogues for Democracy. We also call them in-house the Thurber Dialogues, and the generous supporters and donors who created this are with us today. Jim Thurber, Claudia Thurber, his wife, who have made these possible, and we've been doing these for several years now, hope to continue. Our guest today is Professor Cynthia Miller-Idriss of the Peril. Yes, we like to, I mean, this is the most wonderful acronym we have in the School of Public Affairs, so I'll let you introduce it. And she is, of course, a distinguished author and distinguished professor here at the School of Public Affairs, also in the School of Education. She has published 6 books, and we've just been discussing her 7th, which I think makes a pretty interesting subject just in and of itself, on the subject of radicalization and nationalist movements, particularly among younger people in Western culture and certainly in the United States, but in other countries as well. Cynthia has her degrees from Michigan and from Cornell University. She has been here at AU, I believe, since about 2013. Does that sound right?
10 years.
10 years, exactly. And she has been basically teaching a course that straddles all these fields: sociology, education, SPA, all public affairs, and her research, as is illustrated by her books. I think almost all of them have been by Princeton, have they not?
The last 4,
The last
there's
4.
one Duke and one at NYU.
Okay, all right, in the early going.
Yes.
So we'll talk about those, and we'll talk about those books. I want to give her a chance to do her own introduction of her own research, but I also want to introduce our other guest, Kaitlyn DaViso, who is a graduate student in the Peril program and also is studying for her PhD here and about to choose her thesis topic. She comes to us via University of California at Irvine, where she did her undergraduate work in criminology and justice, and also from the University of Birmingham in the UK, where she got her master's degree in international security and terrorism. Great background for getting involved in this program. And she is a research assistant who shares research interests with Dr. Miller-Idriss. So I want you to tell me, rather than me telling you or asking you questions, but then we will go to questions.
Great.
And we will take questions from each of you here in the audience. Thank you all so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having us and for having me here. And thank you to the Thurbers for this incredible series that you run. It's really a pleasure to be here and especially to have Kaitlyn with me. I really think part of the value of having a lab is to have cultivation of students go on. And so we really try to take those opportunities to co-author, to co-publish, to have students appear whenever possible as part of any kind of public-facing work that we do, and I think it's important and terrific. So the Peril stands for the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. We design and test tools intended to prevent people from being persuaded by propaganda, conspiracy theories, harmful online content that they might encounter, and we test them. So one of the most important things we do is provide evidence back to the field on what's effective. We do that in 2 big types of buckets. One is my co-founder, who's a professor of media studies, also though in the School of Public Affairs, originally media studies. He runs our digital facing work, which is work on short form video, pre-bunking narratives, we call them, designed to show people how online manipulation works. And I just today, I don't think you've seen it yet, saw our evidence on our new suite of videos countering anti-Semitism, and they've come back with terrific, statistically significant findings from 5,000 surveys of college-age students, in fact, college-age youth, that you can prevent people from being persuaded by this propaganda online as well. The other half of the lab is the side that I run, which is community work, community-facing interventions for parents, teachers, caregivers, mental health counselors. We do a lot of work with grandparents, who I find very effective at engaging with teenagers, actually, more than parents in some cases, and also with coaches and faith leaders. So essentially people who surround the lives of a young person who might be going down a rabbit hole, who are equipped to recognize warning signs and who we can improve the confidence and the willingness to intervene. And then we do longitudinal studies with them to see how long do they remember what we taught them, and how long, how equipped are they to stay confident and willing to intervene? And Kaitlyn, maybe you can say a little bit about what you do.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it working? There we go.
You have to hold the angle up like that.
Okay. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for having me here. Thanks for attending, and thank you, Cynthia, for the opportunity. I am a second-year PhD student here in SPA in Justice Law and Criminology. I've been with Peril for the last 2 years, helping to evaluate and get in the data on the effectiveness of these programs, as well as kind of monitor some of the trends to make sure we're getting at what needs to be prevented at any given moment. But as far as my own individual research, I'm interested in extremist narratives and extremist culture and kind of understanding manifestos and memes and the imagery that far-right groups use.
Well, let me ask you both this question. How did you get interested in this? Because there are myriad subjects that could demand your attention in our time, and you have committed a great deal of time in your career to this subject of radicalization, particularly of youth and particularly of males, and we'll get to that subject too. But how did you get started with this? Did it start at Michigan? Did it start when you were a grad student?
It started when I was a grad student. I consider myself an accidental expert. And in fact, one of my friends from that time is in the audience from Germany. I was doing dissertation fieldwork in Germany in vocational schools, where I was interested in young people's identities during a time post-German unification and European integration, how they were faring. And I had 3 schools. The design was to see whether it mattered what occupation you were training for. So I was looking at construction trade workers, skilled hotel workers and cooks who might benefit from tourism, some who would be more rooted in local issues, and then information technology, where they really benefited from globalization. And but when I landed for dissertation field work, and we've talked about this, how your questions change, there happened to be a surge in far-right extremism, anti-Semitism, white supremacist extremism that summer. And in the construction trade school, the teachers who were social studies teachers I was interested in were really just spending a lot of their time thinking about how to confront it. Some of the occupations had significant numbers, a majority of the youth who had shaved heads and bomber jackets and combat boots at that time. And so I went to retreats with them. I did trainings with them. The police came and did workshops. I hung out in the teachers' lounges. I observed their classrooms and really became this accidental expert in school-based responses to research in anti-Semitism and white supremacist extremism. I then did a second book when the aesthetics of the scene in Germany changed, called The Extreme Gone Mainstream, which was about the t-shirts and the new kind of commercialization, so the death of that skinhead aesthetic and a new type of modern appearance. And I turned that book in, and 2 months later, Charlottesville happened here. And then all of a sudden, I was asked to explain the khakis and the polo shirts and the aesthetics of this modern movement here, which had kind of copied the German aesthetics. And so that launched me into discussions here. And I'll just say that after 15 years of studying what Germany does, which is 3 billion euros of investment in prevention that now funds 2,400 prevention programs across the country, where there's very little evidence of whether they work or not, right? So there's a ton of intervention, a ton of funding going on. We don't really know which things are better than the others. But here we have, as a White House official recently said, when I asked him this, how many do you think we have? And he said a few dozen. So, we have a few dozen programs, $20 million of federal funding for a country that's 4 times the size, that has a higher rate of white supremacist violence and propaganda production. So it seemed like a good time to test some ideas for what we might do to prevent it. And that's how the lab got started.
Understood. We had a German TV crew here today, and when they were discussing with the students some of the impulses behind radicalization of white youth and extremism, and one of the reporters from Germany says, well, you understand that we have kind of a sensitivity on the white supremacy and also obviously on anti-Semitism in Germany. We have a greater sensitivity on that subject. Do you think that's possibly why the German government was making such
Definitely.
a major
Yeah.
investment?
Yeah, of course, historically, there's much greater sensitivity. There's just a much greater awareness. I mean, in the US at the time, we had our heads in the sand in ways that everyone has admitted. It's not at all controversial to say that for 20 years after 9/11, essentially, we were unable to see, I think, as a country, the threat landscape as it shifted. And so it wasn't until October of 2020 that under the Trump administration, the US government officially acknowledged that the biggest and most pressing and lethal threat to the US right now is domestic violent extremism. But that trend started in 2009. So it took about, 11 years before the data became so obvious through massive terrorists, El Paso and Pittsburgh and international threats as well, Christchurch and then Buffalo. After all of that, we finally got that acknowledgement. And then January 6th, and then you had the first ever national strategy to prevent domestic violent extremism come out from the US government in June of 2021. So this is all very new for the US to kind of officially, Department of Homeland Security was set up after 9/11. The whole framework of terrorism in the US was Islamist terrorism.
Right. Now, I remember even as far back as 1995, before 9/11, when we had the Oklahoma City bombing at the Alphamura building, the immediate thought was to find everybody who looked Muslim.
Exactly.
In the state of Texas or Oklahoma or for several states around, they arrested quite a number of people.
And I think, and if it hadn't been for 9/11, we might have seen that turn into an awareness of what was bubbling up. But in fact, what happened after Oklahoma City is that white supremacists went underground for a while, and then 9/11 happened. And so by the time they started to come back in the record-breaking hate groups numbers surged after Obama was elected. And that's when, and it never went back down really in 2009. So that's when you really start to see the mobilization. And it just took a long time for the resources to be dedicated in the FBI, in the investigations. There was no prevention money. Prevention money that there was eventually was only going to Islamist forms. So it took a long time. So it's historical, but also 9/11 really created blind spots for us.
Right. Well, now you've written that quote, I'm quoting you here, the United States is fighting extremism all wrong. I believe that was in your Atlantic piece, June of 21. What are we doing wrong, and are we doing any better now?
Well, the U.S. Officially, essentially, very openly says that it's the job of the U.S. government. It's not the job of the U.S. government to prevent someone from becoming radicalized. It's the job of the U.S. government to prevent a radicalized person from picking up a gun. So I think that's a mistake, right? Because basically you allow radicalization to happen in a sort of unfettered way in the name of free speech. I understand why the concern about you have the right to become radicalized exists. But, and then you just have to pour more and more resources into the security apparatus to make sure that we're infiltrating, monitoring, surveilling, and preventing, and then censoring essentially as much as possible to prevent violence. So it's what we call the barricading the doors approach, where you teach synagogues to barricade the doors before services. That's literally one of the strategies that we teach in the US government approach. And that's great. Like, that has saved lives. But as I often say, I don't think anyone wants our best measure of effectiveness on prevention to be like how good we've become at barricading the doors. So we, I think, have worked very hard in peril to say we need a more public health approach. We have recognized now that we don't treat cardiac disease or diabetes just by waiting for the incidence of disease, but we actually run heart healthy programs, and we run, every YMCA and hospital has programs on diabetes, what you can do with exercise and eating habits. And we don't believe that we're forcing people to choose those things. We're equipping them with tools to make better choices.
You mentioned infiltration as one device and one technique. And I believe the FBI worked pretty hard at infiltrating, say, the KKK back in the day. And there are movies about this. It was glamorized by Hollywood. But has that been a generally successful effort on the part of intelligence agencies, domestics?
Yeah, we're lucky that they're so good at it, because they do break up some 40 plots a year still. Something about like average 40, maybe 30 to 40 a year.
Where does that statistic come from? FBI estimates?
I think that's the Purist data set. It's a good question. So I cite it in a New York Times op-ed, so we could look at the hyperlink and see what the, but I know it's about 40 a year that they've been breaking up. And, it's, that includes things like the Baltimore infrastructure attack, right? So it's like different types of attacks that the ISIS attack that just happened. I mean, not just white supremacist attacks, but like the ISIS plot that just got broken up. So you hear about these in the news and periodically, and you realize that a plot has been broken up, and that's good. The Boogaloo Boys plot to kidnap the Michigan governor that I quote in the title of my book, that was broken up because of an FBI infiltration of the group. So we're glad that they do that. I think there's sort of two problems. One, the vast majority of radicalization today happens not through groups, but through self-radicalization, sort of networks online, exposure to online propaganda, conspiracy theories, and harmful content. And so, even when you look at successful terrorist actors, I hate to use that word, but every terrorist actor on the far right who has executed an attack was not a member of a group, all the way back to Oklahoma City. So, so the ones who get through, it's almost impossible. You can't use infiltration. You can't use monitoring. There's no group, right? They're self-radicalizing online. So you need a different strategy when you have so much online exposure and self-radicalization. And so I want the infiltration to continue on the groups, but that's the minority of what we're facing in terms of the possible lethality. It's much more these lone actors that we then have to count on parents sometimes to turn them in, teachers to turn them in. And often even when they do that, like in the case of the Buffalo shooter, they go right on to commit the crime.
Right. And so much of this takes place through social media and that sort of thing. You would be calling for something of a surveillance state.
Right, which I don't think any of us want, right? So ideally, you have less bad content circulating, but you also, and you have our team would argue that you have less production and more rejection of that content when people encounter it because they recognize it for what it is.
Okay, now let's talk a little about the content a little bit. The actual ideologies that are being spread, not quite the same thing as KKK. You can tell me if they're borrowings and so on. Not quite the same as the KKK. I did some work years ago on a group called Posse Comitatus, Power of the County, belief that only the county sheriff has any true authority in Anglo-American culture, and that all the rest of it is a plot and a superstructure of communism or whatever you want to call it. Those kinds of ideologies had a day as well. They were, I suppose, harmonious with racism and so forth, but it wasn't necessarily all about race. It certainly wasn't all about gender at the time. It did not seem to be as virulently misogynist. Is there a sense of the nature of that shift or the shift in ideologies that you've studied?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple different things. One, we have a broader, I call them supremacist belief systems. So white supremacist extremism is still, the core, the most prominent and most frequent player, I guess, in that spectrum. But we have Christian supremacy now with Christian nationalist movements, which I know you've looked at quite a bit. Male supremacism, which is a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority that really positions women as an existential threat, but also anti-LGBTQ work and ideologies fit into that. And so, and then Western supremacism, that's where the Proud Boys fit in. So, because they call themselves Western chauvinists, so it's a kind of civilizational idea. And so that, it's broader than they're the same kind of logic, but it's broader than. And then you have the whole anti-government side, which you're talking about, the sovereign citizens, the unlawful militias. They've been around, especially since the 70s, and continue to mobilize and are obviously played a role on January 6th to some extent, the Oath Keepers, and also other kinds of groups that mobilize around defense often of the nation, sometimes drawing more heavily than we would like on veterans.
Which brings me back to the word militia. You did mention militia groups. I know that when you did an NPR interview a while back, when Audie Cornish was still with NPR, on ATC, talking about the growth of militia groups. How has that evolved in particular, the people who go off in the woods with their weaponry and have maneuvers?
Yeah, those are actually easier to infiltrate. So that's, I feel like those are, I'm less worried about the militias, even though they are mobilizing, because they're they're classic in their structure. They have hierarchies, they have initiation rites, generally speaking. And they're understandable in the same form that our traditional tactics for infiltration, surveillance, and monitoring have been successful. So they are growing. That is a problem. Where you see variation from that has been problematic is something like the Boogaloo scenes, which are a group of, they're not even a group, that's the problem. They are a collection of individually organized groups of what they call Boogaloo boys that were mobilized around a concept of civil war, of a second civil war coming. But they don't share an ideology other than the concept of civil war. Some of them are white supremacists, some of them are not. And they're very dangerous. I think there were 5 murders of police officers in the summer of 2020 that have produced terrorism trials. Then there's that kidnapping plot against the governor of Michigan. And originally it was a meme. So they don't fit the categories. Like Boogaloo was a meme created by teenagers that eventually mobilized into action by forming groups on Facebook, which shut down. So it was a real example of online choose your own adventure kind of collection of things that don't fit into classic frameworks. Would you say? I know you've looked at the Boogaloo scenes a little bit too.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also add that I think all of these modern far-right extremist movements are really fundamentally based on conspiratorial thinking in a way that they may not have been previously. And it's really born out of like fear and perceived threats, where they invent these narratives and concepts based off of misinformation that's just a story of something they fear happening that's kind of evolves into more hateful fueled ideologies.
Yeah, one of the things I often say is that one of the most persuasive forms of propaganda we found, two of the most persuasive forms, anything related to safety is very persuasive. But anything related to something being taken away from you or being stolen from you is also very persuasive for this reason. So both of those relate to fear. So your Second Amendment rights are going to be stolen, your white majority country, your election, right? A whole bunch of things. And that turns out to be one of the most persuasive types of propaganda that exists. And really it plays on this sense of not just fear, but precariousness, this idea that something could be lost, even if it hasn't been lost yet. And what's important about that is that the data shows that, for example, it's not the most disenfranchised who are likely to radicalize, it's those who are at risk of being disenfranchised. So like you're not more likely to join the far right if you are unemployed, but you are more likely to join if you grew up in a household with an unemployed parent. So whatever gives you the sense of precariousness puts you at greater risk for being persuaded by propaganda that says something could be taken from you.
I believe it was the University of Chicago that organized some graduate students to study the January 6th rioters, particularly obviously ones they could identify who had been arrested, but also going beyond that. And I believe, correct me if I'm misremembering this, but I believe that the people who were found to be most predominant were not from strictly rural areas. And they were also not from urban areas, but they were from in between. They were from the fringes of metropolitan areas. Is that, do I remember
Yeah,
that right?
that is right. And it's also the case that they were disproportionately, not just disproportionately middle class or upper middle class, but disproportionately had experienced something in their life, like a tax lien, a bankruptcy, an eviction. And again, it's not that they were precarious exactly economically, financially, but they had experienced something at some point in their life that made them feel it could happen again. And that, I think, is the condition that makes people more susceptible to propaganda that says something's being stolen from you. So it's, and the geographic issue is an interesting one that we don't really have answers to that, but that's maybe there's something aligned with past histories of precariousness there too.
Or maybe they went to the fringes of the metropolitan area from someplace else and feel less stable or less secure, I should say, in that environment. Well, you've written about the rise of a new white power movement, and you've written about several different groups. I noticed you mentioned the Boogaloo Boys, the Proud Boys, and this all seems to have a particular appeal for white males and particularly under 30. Am I exaggerating?
That's true. I mean, I would say it's not just appealing to those under 30 because there are, definitely older men who are attracted to these movements, but under 35 is higher risk of violence. So I do worry about the under 30, under 35 group the most. Yeah, I would say, the first thing I have to say is that there are real grievances for young men in particular in this society. So we know this data is there that white men in particular are 4 times more likely to commit suicide in the U.S. That the New York Times just did this fantastic analysis of declining income among non-college educated men. So you can see, higher rates of deaths of despair, overdoses, anxiety, depression, right? Like there really are 60% of college graduates now are women, so a declining percentage of men graduating from university. So there are real issues. I think for me, the question is, why do those real issues turn into a willingness to scapegoat both women and ethnic and racial religious minorities? That's because of conspiracy theories that you find online that tell people this is who's to blame for your problem. It's an organized plot. And those conspiracy theories are ubiquitous and unrelenting. I mean, they're just everywhere that young men spend time. I heard last week from Evian Leidig that when I was in the Netherlands and we were speaking together, that there's a study that shows it takes a 14-year-old boy's account 13 minutes on average to encounter Andrew Tate. And if you don't know Andrew Tate content, I'm really glad for you, but it's an example of horrific misogynist content that's being packaged and sold to boys and young men as a success strategy. And there are thousands of influencers like that that teach how to exploit women for profit.
I was going to ask if there were particular figures, and you mentioned a couple taking it into politics, maybe a Kirk rather.
Yeah.
Sorry, Charlie Cook. My apologies to you, Charlie Kirk, and to some degree Joe Rogan, but Joe's maybe a little more mainstream.
Yeah.
And you have already mentioned a couple of the names. Are there other people, whether in politics or mostly just in media?
Well, I think we've seen a lot of legitimation through Trump, of course. I think, the perception of perception of legitimation and the normalization of some of the rhetoric, both the misogynist and the racist rhetoric, just at the Madison Square Garden rally this week with the comedian. You see that type of thing. You see people in those rallies chanting "the hoes got to go" about Harris, right? That is unimaginable in any other Republican rally, right? Much like, it's just there's been a legitimation and a permission setting to say awful things, and that I think has contributed to it. So I think you can't not say that that's happened. Would you say anything else on figures? Yeah, individuals.
Well, the other thing besides individuals that people point to or look for is a timeline.
Yeah.
So give me a timeline in your mind. When did this emerge? I mean, we already mentioned
2009. Yeah. So
2000.
yeah, I would say 2001. I mean, there's sort of pivotal moments, right? So 9/11 creates this culture of fear and a backlash in the form of real kind of nativism, anti-immigration, and Islamophobia. But then you have the election of the first Black president and the surge in hate groups. You also have a lot of gendered social changes that start to happen that produce backlash on the male supremacy side. So same-sex marriage gets legalized, women in the military, you start to see a lot more trans rights being visible. You see the use of a much more diverse range of pronouns and backlash around that then in the form of book banning and curriculum fights in school boards. So gendered social changes become a kind of culture wars moment and a moral panic moment as well. That's all happening sort of like 2015, 16, around the time that we start to have a presidential candidate and then a president who is perceived to be legitimizing and normalizing this stuff and sometimes is legitimizing and normalizing it. And the so-called alt-right emerges, and then you get Charlottesville. So Charlottesville, I think, becomes a real turning point in the awareness of the country, followed by a series of awful violence, El Paso, Pittsburgh in particular, but other Poway, California, on a synagogue, a bunch of other attacks like that, and then Buffalo. And I think that's when we really saw, when Buffalo happened, we start to see a real shift in awareness of the connection between mass violence and some of the online radicalization.
Yeah, I would also add that, none of these extremist ideologies are new.
Right.
There's been pivotal points that have changed kind of the way they operate, but these things are just about as old as our history as a country. The last time we saw, in my opinion, correct me if you disagree, but the last time we saw kind of the heyday of these extremist movements was following another period of social change throughout the civil rights movement and the racial awareness in the 50s and 60s was kind of what sparked a heyday in that time. So these things are not new. If anything, it's just history kind of repeating itself. But what is different is the presence of social media and the general awareness of what's happening across the country, as well as the government's awareness and kind of attempts to kind of prevent and thwart these things.
Yeah, I would also just add that there was a time, which some of you will remember, when political violence from the left was the biggest threat to the country. And you can see that in the data is really clearly in the 70s into the early 80s, with Weather Underground and Marxist Leninist movements and bombings and the data. That's just not where we are now. So there are movements on the left that are problematic and escalating. So even climate change activists and environmental extremists are ramping up with, we were just talking about the climate activists who are gluing themselves to tarmacs and highways in Europe, and escalating attacks on art, for example, and on nuclear transport train tracks, right? So there's always that possibility of that escalating as we hear young people say things like, as we do on college campuses here now, there is no political solution, right? So the idea that politics aren't working on any, whether it's on immigration or on climate change, that's a call to violence that we all should be vigilant against. And we do see things that cut across ideologies that I think are really important, like anti-Semitism and misogyny, which exist across the spectrum. And then the last thing we see, not new ideologies, but new hybrid ideologies. So there's like eco-fascism, which is motivated, the El Paso terrorist is an environmental justification, climate change driven environmental justification for white supremacist violence, in which he believed that there's not going to be enough space for white people, and so we should eliminate migrants. And so
The great replacement theory.
yeah, right. And it's great replacement theory combined with climate change, essentially. So it's an eco-fascist is the idea, but it's blending environmental ideas with fascist and white supremacist ideas.
Remarkable. You mentioned the rally Sunday night. What did you think? I'm going to assume you weren't there.
I was not there. Yes.
I also would assume that you've seen much of it.
Yeah, I've seen much of it and heard and had a lot of media inquiries about it. I mean, I think just the number of media inquiries is a signal that it represents a different moment in people's awareness of how bad some of the rhetoric has gotten and how willing and normalized some of the rhetoric has gotten. So I do worry a lot about that normalization. I mean, even just what we saw in Springfield with the kind of bomb threats and violence that Haitian immigrants have faced since the eating the pets narrative became repeated, I should say the false narrative, the false claim that pets are being eaten, circulated, that, even when it seems absurd, like you think that couldn't possibly mobilize people, it does. It mobilizes people to violence. And so I worry a lot about, when you dehumanize, when you compare people to garbage, or say a whole country of immigrants are rapists, as he has said, or refer, those types of things are just so beyond the pale. And then the attacks on Harris that involve like claims about sexual activity or anything else are just not what you would want to see in a deliberative democracy that is inclusive of multiple parties, right?
Does it serve as any kind of watershed for you? Do you look at that rally on Sunday night, and some people have done, comparing it to, for example, the America First rally prior to Pearl Harbor that was in the same venue and featured Charles Lindbergh and a number of other people who were prominent at the time. There was not, as it turned out, a presidential candidate leading the bill, but they were very much representing a political threat to Franklin Roosevelt and to his third term. And they had a huge following. Is there any other historical analogy that rally on Sunday night struck with you?
Nothing, I mean, nothing that I haven't already thought, right? So it wasn't, the way I think of that rally is like shocking but not surprising, which is the same way I thought about January 6th, which is shocking but not surprising. Like we have been seeing, repeatedly signs of that type of rhetoric, that type of support for that rhetoric, the normalization of it. And, unfortunately, what I think will happen after the election, regardless of the outcome, is also sort of very predictable, which is pockets of violence in local election areas with people who are dissatisfied by the election results, no matter the outcome of the presidential election, right? The legitimation right now that people feel to move toward violence and what the polling says on people's willingness to support political violence if they don't like the outcomes of things, that's not great. And so I think that's where most people in my field are hypervigilant right now, is on the local elections in terms of where we're probably going to see pockets of violence.
Well, we've already mentioned January 6th a couple, three times, just naturally comes up. Uh, do you think that particular event was a watershed because there was a taboo around the Capitol? That everyone sees the Capitol theoretically as the temple of democracy, whatever else you believe in, whatever else your ideology. And so it was unthinkable that people would trash the Capitol, break into the Capitol, fight police officers to try to effectuate this coup d'etat or whatever they thought they were doing. In essence, they were interrupting the certification of the process. Was there a taboo that was ripped away at that moment that is hard to restore?
Yes and no. I mean, I think there were the images obviously were shocking. You watch those. I mean, there are so many different layers of shocking, and remembering that people died that day, and were permanently injured that day, and when you look at like the ebullience and the joy of some of the rioters, right, at what they were doing and how excited they were to get in despite that violence. I think that's one of the more chilling things that I saw. And then the images that you see with some of the symbols that were there. So not everybody there was there. In fact, there's a wide range of like what I call a lowest common denominator mobilization that day, which is like there's so many things that people who were there don't agree on, but they all agreed in that moment spontaneously on this challenging the certification of the election. But so you saw things like the Kyrgyzstan flag, which is, like a fantastical white ethno-state flag, and Auschwitz references on T-shirts. And then you had the organized militias with their radios there, like we're clearly, planning and planning. And then you had like grandmothers and, QAnon T-shirts with their sons, right? I mean, it was just, there were a bizarre kind of spectrum of things that were happening there. And so, yes, I think it broke taboos. I think it kind of shocked the nation. I think one of the most shocking things for me was like the gallows hanging outside. I mean, the kind of idea of how much worse things could have been if they had continued to move forward in an unfettered way is chilling. Like that makes me a little bit nervous still. And so at the same time, how quickly it just sort of got erased and how quickly people, sort of accepted that it happened means to me that the taboo is not really quite the taboo that we might want it to be.
Well, once torn away, it's hard to return the veil. I want to ask one more question, giving you an opportunity to hit a positive note here before I turn this over to questions from our audience. But Heidi Beirich, if that's how she pronounces her name, from the Global Projects Against Hate and Extremism, has written that your work does something more important than revealing the social movements because it also gives us solutions, methods for stopping the spread of hateful ideas among young people. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I love Heidi. That's a really nice thing for Heidi to say. Heidi, who used to direct the intelligence project at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and so we have partnered with her for a long time. I think, what I hope the lab does is provide evidence, first of all, that because I think the evidence has to lead of what works to prevent people in a very upstream way from being persuaded by the kinds of things that can lead them down those rabbit holes. One of the things that I'm really proud of is that we lead with the evidence, we take the time to study it. One of the things I struggle with, I'll say, is that we hardly ever have time to share that evidence in the ways that I would like. So Richie Lee, is it your first day, Richie? It's like second, third day. We have a new senior researcher like here, and Dan Relihan, some of our senior research team, who I know are, trying to scramble together the time to publish more of this and get it out on the peer-reviewed side. I talk about it as much as possible. I'll say that's the disadvantage of an externally funded lab, is that we're all project-based, and so we're always making deliverables, to the funder, and then we have to move on to the next project. So, super proud of the work we're doing. I think we have shown that you can produce statistically significant evidence that prevents people from, that there are tools to prevent people from going down those rabbit holes, and tools to equip communities with more confidence and knowledge on how to intervene. I think the challenge now is it feels like we're just scratching the surface, and how do you scale it up?
I think too, in this field of terrorism and political violence, it's really easy to focus on everything that's going wrong and all of the problems that we see and the data that's not promising and everything that's just looks downtrodden. But one of the first things that Cynthia said to me when I met her was, the world is on fire, but what are we going to do about it? And I think about that a year and a half later all the time, because that's really what we're trying to do here at Peril, and just in our research generally, is how can we make the change so that this doesn't continue?
Very well. Thank you, Kaitlyn. Let's open this up for your questions. And we have a microphone for you because we'll need that to make it part of the live stream and the recording. So I will be more than glad to give Claudia.
Hi, Claudia Thurber. Could you address the role of women in what you're talking about? Or do we not have to worry about our daughters and our granddaughters? Can we just go home and sleep well tonight?
I wish I could tell you that we don't have to worry about them. There's several different ways to address the women. One, women are playing a bigger role in these movements themselves. In several different ways. They are more likely to be violent actors now, as we saw on January 6th, for example. We saw some women there who are real violent actors, including one who was shot and killed through a door while trying to breach the Capitol Rotunda area. So we see women engaged very heavily in the social media space as sort of influencers who are softening the face of the movements and trying to recruit people into them, with talk shows, with interviews, with live streams of them with their 6 white babies in the kitchen, and they're encouraging people to have as many white babies as they have had in order to reproduce and counter demographic change. And they have organic recipes at the same time, and a lot of great relatable content that can be kind of persuasive to watch. One of the interesting things I also just recently heard about that from Evian Leidig, who's a colleague and friend who we work with, who studies women in these movements, is that many of those influencers who have very popular channels online, actually the majority of their subscribers or followers are men, not women, right? And so you think they're there recruiting women, but actually what they're doing is adding to this sort of fantasy that a lot of men have about what they want their wife to be like, producing the 6 white babies. Well, and they're softening and recruiting and softening that recruitment and sharing the ideology for men, and then calling on the men to be the defenders and the providers and the fighters of the white race and the protectors of the women and babies. So it's still insidious, and it works on it, even though they're not out there necessarily violently organizing. They are contributing to it. So there's that sort of part of it. And then there is, I would say, the non-active side in which women are, I often say in the lab, and we have said that the 2 biggest types of propaganda that are the starting point or the end point of almost everything we see online are anti-Semitic and anti-feminist propaganda. And it doesn't really matter where you start. You usually end up with one of them, and often intertwined. So these narratives, and we're seeing this, I think, now in the gender gap in the electorate, which I think is 30 points right now among Gen Z. Gen Z young men are the least likely of any of the generations to say they support feminism. So less than boomer men, less than Gen X, less than millennial. They are less likely to, I mean, like on pretty much every measure that you have, Gen Z men are less supportive of women's rights and also of LGBTQ rights. So that's, I think, a consequence of this exposure to what I call relentless and ubiquitous anti-feminist narratives online. I mean, we just see them all over the place, both conspiratorial ones that you're talking about and also just scapegoating ones that say that women are to blame for the bad things you're experiencing. And men are experiencing bad outcomes, but that scapegoating doesn't have to be a natural kind of outcome of it, I would say. So, so women, I think, are increasingly, and so that's where I would just say we've had also a rise in male supremacist violence, what we often call misogynist incel violence, which is involuntary celibate men who have attacked a sorority, a yoga studio. There's a Toronto van attack. A number of school shootings that we've had have had incel underpinnings. Both of the two most recent terrorist attacks in Germany were not officially identified as incel attacks, but there were incel references in the manifesto, and or in one case, he was listening to a song that's widely called the Incel Manifest, Incel, I forget what it's called. It's like a song that is praising the shooter that is often lauded. You'll notice I don't name shooters. That's deliberate. So I call them by their city or where it happened, but not the name because they want notoriety, and so I won't give it to them.
The incel is involuntary celibates.
Yes.
Okay.
Involuntary celibates, but just to say that not all incels are violent or misogynist. So incels actually are a community created originally by a woman of people online who were unable to form sexual or romantic relationships, and they were sort of finding each other. And then a wing of it became what's now the most well-known part of it, which is violent, misogynist anger at women, and also anger at men who are deemed more sexually successful than they are. So it's not just women who are the targets, but also like what they call alpha men.
Okay. I'm not sure that was all that reassuring, Claudia. Very, very interesting. Let me pass the mic around. I know there are other people who have questions. Yes. Well, I'll go with you first. For reasons I don't know.
Yeah, hi. As you might have heard, I'm from Germany. And my question is that in Germany, we're deeply concerned about the right-wing movement in our country, especially because of our history. This kind of right-wing movement or supremacy, we see almost globally, worldwide. Are those parties or organizations, are they connected, or is it all only in its single country?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they are connected, not in a, I don't want to say like in a conspiratorial way. They are connected, but though in two different ways. One, they're inspired by each other, so they copy each other and they follow what each other do. And so you have, and they don't just follow what each other do, they follow what the left does. So like Steve Bannon trying to create a university, right, to promote sort of far right ideas, was a model of George Soros's Central European University in Hungary that he tried to, now it's in Vienna. So this idea that you could create kind of an academy for right-wing ideas was actually a copying of the left, which is something that's happened over time in other kinds of movements with what's called the New Right and the attempt to get more cultural hegemony. So there's lots of different ways that they copy each other, and they also look at the strategies that the left has used to successfully get elected officials in place who promote multicultural ideas, for example. That's one way. The other way is just the circulation of propaganda, and this is where I think the US has a really outsized responsibility, because the last figure I saw is that we export something like 85% of the propaganda that circulates on white supremacist extremism in English. So a lot of it comes from the US, from groups that are in the US, and then it circulates and gets picked up. And that's true of things like QAnon too. So we made the groomer slur in the anti-LGBTQ space. We produce QAnon. We produce a lot of the white supremacist propaganda and some of the innovations, if you will, in like the far-right music scene that goes on tour across Europe. But Europe has produced the T-shirts, the clothing, the commercialization that's come back here. So, the youth culture circulates widely, the propaganda circulates, and they copy each other. So I don't think it's that coincidental. They look at the same thing with populist movements, look at the success of the idea that the corrupt elite are, against the ordinary people, and see that narrative as successful, and then populists have used that around the world. So it's like a playbook, if you will, and they're following that playbook really successfully.
I was just wondering how the prevalence of mental illness within Generation Z affects and
Thank you.
okay, exacerbates the potential radicalization of young men.
I'm so glad you asked that question. So, two ways I would say. One, actually three ways I'm going to say. And one of these is very sensitive. I'm going to word it very carefully and hopefully not get misquoted on this. So, there is a higher prevalence of autism in some male supremacist scenes. So, and some of that is, and it's higher prevalence of self-identified autistic individuals. That's important to say, right? And some of how that plays out is in a victimization narrative that individuals will say, I will never have the social skills to have these relationships, and then are angry and lashing out, right? So it's not necessarily the neurodivergence, which is not mental illness that you're talking about exactly, but the neurodivergence, but the way that neurodivergence plays out sometimes in the grievance narratives, that appears to be the case. So I want to be very careful about that, because one, you can stigmatize an entire group of people, and that's not my intention at all, but I think that it's something that happens in some of these spaces. The mental illness, the second way that it plays out, I think, is this other legitimate grievance narrative, where we see that men have higher rates right now of anxiety, depression, isolation, untreated mental illness in those kind of capacities, in ways that can contribute to also a victimization narrative and get fed into the scapegoating and conspiracy theories about people exploiting and being to blame for your problems. And then the third way I would say is the path that I'm most interested in preventing, and that I work on in my new book and in the lab, which is actually self-help searches that algorithmically are now known to lead to rabbit holes of bad content and information. So a classic way you have is boys who go online looking for help, like, how do I get my life together? They land on someone pretty quickly who gives them like a 12-step program for getting their life together, and it works because it's like basic help, like get up and make your bed in the morning, make sure you're getting enough sleep, reduce sugar, like stop drinking alcohol, don't stay up all night gaming, like whatever it is, and go to the gym, and then they do start to feel better. They've got more endorphins, their bodies are fitter, they're getting along better with people, they form relationships. And then that comes, though, with a bunch of scapegoating, or it adds in scapegoating material, right? And it's sometimes very insidious. And I'll just give you one example from years ago, when somebody sent me a link to a home improvement YouTube series where you were doing, it was like 12-step video to build something, like something in your garage. I can't even remember what it was. And the first two videos were just normal. And then by the third video, he starts introducing kind of like anti-immigrant content, but you're stuck in the project now, right? So, and it's really subtle in the beginning, and you have to keep watching the videos to finish the project. And by the time you get to the end, it's full on white supremacist content. So it's insidious, it's gradual, it draws people in, and it gets them into a sequence of videos that they are incentivized to finish because they've purchased all this material, and they might not even gradually notice they have this parasocial relationship with the guy. So that's an example of how it happens with a home improvement project, but it happens too with self-improvement projects. And I think that's really common, and we see that a lot with like 14-year-old boys, unfortunately.
Can we share the mic? Yes, right to your right. Thank you very much.
What is our greatest peril? Is it the lone wolf? Is it the organized groups? What?
I would say the thing I worry about the most is our inability to invest in prevention, right? So our decision to invest in security instead. So in other words, I think after January 6th, we got $200 million of extra funding to secure the US Capitol building alone, and prevention funding for the whole country doubled from 10 million to $20 million. So I'm not saying we don't need that 200 million, but it is, there should be a world in which we have as much prevention funding as we do security funding, and where there's as much dialogue across borders about prevention solutions as there is about security and intelligence solutions. I spend a lot of time talking to security and intelligence agencies or going to places like Europol, which are fantastic. And I love being there because the resources are great and they have interesting things to say. And I have only once been invited to an international gathering where there were practitioners there across borders, right? You never get social workers or educators together to talk about shared ideas and solutions. So I worry that we suffer from an inability to imagine a world in which we could prevent this stuff, and we keep raising the bar of how much money we'll spend to securitize our way through it. And that's like a lack of creativity. I don't know.
Not to just continue to add things to be worried about, but in my perspective, I think that the biggest fear is the normalization of these hate-filled ideologies and the grievances, the normalization that's coming through social media and other news media platforms, as well as from politicians, really creates a world in which we are beginning to villainize each other and not connect on like a human level that is ultimately leading to some of these other issues down the line.
I'm going to just add a question to that just real
Yes,
quickly.
yeah.
Kaitlyn, you were in Great Britain recently and got your second degree there, your master's degree. Do you see parallels in terms of the behavior of young white males in that country? Let's not limit it strictly to, but we've been talking a lot about young white males. And in the Brexit movement and some of the English purity or whatever else you want to call them groups, do you see parallels there, and what are the similarities and differences?
I think there are parallels, and I think that the data shows too that there are parallels in the things that just Western-based countries are experiencing with white supremacy and male supremacist beliefs, but it does look different in countries with different historical backgrounds. America has a history of racism that the UK has to a different extent. So I think white supremacy looks different there, and because of that is maybe not recognized or called out to the same extent that it is in the United States, but it certainly still exists.
I mean, we claim that. Oh, there we go. We'll share that over here after that. No, you go right ahead.
Hi, fascinating discussion. To what extent is the need to belong, to be part of something, an important element in the radicalization? Because you mentioned the age 30 to 35 as being somewhat of a cutoff. And after that point, people go off and focus on work, truly focus on work, maybe find relationships, what have you. I noticed that, let's say, one partisan side of the spectrum has great opportunities to be part of something and be involved and listen day and night to media, while the other doesn't. Is that an important element?
Absolutely. And we were just talking about this today in an independent study discussion with some students that actually I find there's two twin impulses that, especially for teenagers and young adults, and especially for young men, I think are really important and equally important. One is the desire to belong, to be a part of something, to have a sense of meaning and purpose that's bigger and better than yourself. And extremist groups do an excellent job of offering that to young men in particular. A sense of heroism often, of saving your people, your civilization, the idea that you're martyring even yourself, you're sacrificing yourself for the good of the whole. I mean, those are all very strong narratives that come across. We even have, within young men's discourse online who are trying to emulate other terrorist shooters, they have like a saint and disciples kind of narrative, right? So it's very much almost like imbued with a sacred idea of like what it is to really belong and to belong to this tribe and this group. But the other side of that is the need, I think, to rebel and to reject and to express anger sometimes at mainstream society that's left you down and let you down often. And you find that narrative also very strongly in the cultural side of these movements, of youth movements, in the memes, in the iconography of T-shirts. The clothing companies, one of the companies in Germany I was describing today, there's a pair of sweatpants, and I won't say it out loud, but it says F your society, which I think is like, your society is interesting, the not just you, but your, like that we are outside of this. And I think a lot of what we've seen among the mobilization over the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years among young men in the US and globally is that the far right has successfully positioned itself as counterculture, as countercultural to like a boring, triggered mainstream who just can't take the joke. So they use a lot of humor and edginess and irony and satire through memes, through short form video and others. And then they seem like kind of edgier compared to this boring set of adults who are telling you what to do. And so I think we, in the prevention space and in general, the left hasn't done very, like there's a saying that the left can't meme, like the left doesn't do as good a job at countering that humor and irony and satire because it's been very appealing to sort of young men in particular. So I think those two impulses are really important to understand. How can you engage? Can you engage humor, or do you have to come at it with seriousness? Can you find a way to make like countering racism cool and not right? So like, what are the strategies to not just making fun of people cool, right? Like, but to reverse course in a way. And so I think that's some of the things that we try to think about. Or can you poke fun at some of the things in a gentle way, like the machismo of some of these militia groups that like go out with their very puffed up gear and their SWAT gear. Like we talked about, should we do a video that, and we thought that was too risky. So, you know, like what can you do to counter and provoke in your own way with humor that might disrupt? So I think that those are some of the things that we've been trying to think of.
I will also add too quickly that when we think about or talk about risk factors for violent extremism, across a variety of studies, there's been like over 100 different factors that have found to be correlated or related in some extent to violent extremism. But across a ton of different theories, the desire for community remains consistent. So it's obviously showing up again and again as something that's crucial to bringing people to commit the action.
And at a moment when we see the lowest levels of belonging among young men that I've ever seen in the data, right? I mean, I think the number of young men in the US now who say they have 0 friends is, I don't remember what it is, but it's way higher than it should be, right? You want that to be 0, and it's not 0. Or they have no close friends except people they know online, right? That's really different than previous generations. And it's something that we have to address kind of separate from the potential for radicalization, but clearly plays into that vulnerability.
Yes.
Yes, this is bringing in the foreign actors. And 2016, 2020, now in 24, there have been Russians that have been indicted for under FARA, Foreign Agents Registration Act, for intervening in our political system. My question is, yes, they're doing it, but what's the impact of it? Is anyone measuring that? The impact of propaganda that disrupts our democracy?
Yeah, there are some folks working on Russian and Iranian propaganda. You know, I like, for example, I think the case of the Tim Waltz video just last week or the week before is a perfect example of this like fake student video.
We're seeing AI now.
Yeah, right, exactly. So creating a fake, you know, using a real student name, but a fake video to say that there had been some abuses, and then that being traced back and publicly acknowledged. And I think a $10 million reward from the US government now being issued for the perpetrators who are Russian. And that was shared millions of times, right? I mean, people believed it and are willing to believe it. And so I think we obviously have foreign actors who are taking advantage and coached in some cases by Americans, as we've seen as well. I mean, Americans who are helping over there who've gone. And so it's complicated, and it's part of why I think the best thing that I can think of to spend my time doing is helping people become more media literate, right? And more able to at least be skeptical of the media that comes across their screen before they click and reshare, before they're persuaded by it. And one of the things that we've been talking to some funders about recently is when we're looking at creating safeguarding communities, safeguarding families from harm, children from harms that they encounter online, radicalization to violent extremism is one of those outcomes, but we had 36 suicides of young men last year who were sextorted by criminal gangs who convinced them online that they were girls asking for nude pictures and then threatened to spread that, to all their friends and family if they didn't pay them $500, right? So, and then many more cases of those who did pay the money and then reported it. So, the levels of manipulation, the IRS scams of the elderly, right? There's lots of different things that we can equip. And I think in a soup to nuts, media literacy thing that fits under violent extremism, but ideally, if we do it well, we're safeguarding people from a lot of other harms, including foreign propaganda.
What about grandparents?
I love grandparents. So I love my own grandparents who I don't have anymore, but they also we spend a lot of time with grandparents. So we do this work with parents and caregivers, and we call that the caregivers part of it is grandparents, basically, because and sometimes aunts and uncles. But one of the things we find is that grandparents often, and I have 2 teenagers myself, so I can say this with some authority, grandparents can ask questions of kids that parents cannot. And they also often see them at intervals that are a little bit more helpful, right? So it's like when you see a kid every day, you might not notice changes, but grandparents often are aware if they know what to look for. So one of the things we tell grandparents to do is they're really good anyway at being curious about their grandchildren. And if you can approach things with curiosity and get kids to teach you something, it works really well to start those conversations. So we often just tell grandparents to ask kids how memes work. And then that opens up a really great conversation. Like, how do you create a meme? How does it spread? How can you change it? What does it mean? How do you know it's funny? Right. And kids will start talking about it. And then sometimes in that process, kids will share a meme that's not funny, right? That you don't think is funny at all, that has some Holocaust denialism in it, or has some something racist in it, or misogynist. Or you can say, hey, I saw this meme on my feed. Can you tell me what it means, right? And they will, and then well, why is that funny, right? And actually it starts to get, because they get so desensitized to the content that comes across their screen, often they just don't see it anymore, and they're repeating stuff that is actually not funny. So I think grandparents are a really good intervener.
There are those of us who appreciate that role. But, yeah.
Hi, thanks for this. I'm curious, for obvious reasons, and some you alluded to, religion plays a potentially troubling compounding role, providing cover, fuel for a lot of these extremist developments. But it also strikes me, because of the formal and structural similarities, that there's perhaps a unique potential for religion to play a constructive role in the de-radicalization. And you mentioned this early on, but I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, actually, one of my favorite projects, and I don't think we have anyone on the team here from Peril who was, maybe I'm wrong. Is anybody in the Texas work? No. We had a 2-year project funded by the Department of Homeland Security with evangelical pastors in Texas that created a Peace Builders Toolkit, which is free and downloadable on our website. And it's amazing. It was an amazing project. It was an amazing opportunity. They came to us asking for help with what they were seeing in their congregations. And we really got to engage, and we decided on a training of trainer models because we knew we weren't going to be able to effectively go into congregations, but the pastors could. And so if we could train the pastors to be able to recognize warning signs and know how to intervene. One of the things we did with that toolkit is created, forget what they're called, like conversation cards, basically. They're printable, downloadable, and they're things for like Bible study to talk about social media, or when parents and grandparents have like sessions, or students, kids have sessions on Sunday mornings, they can do that. So I think it's a great opportunity because you can draw people in. I'm a preacher's kid myself, a PK, so like obviously I have thoughts on this. Katie, my co-founder, is also a preacher's kid, right? So we have like those roots in in sort of understanding the potential, even though there's also a lot of harm being done on the Christian nationalism side and elsewhere, on the Islamist radicalization side too. But I think the potential for people of faith to see the ways that their communities can be places and community spaces where you can stop some of this from happening, recognize early, and lean into kind of moral and ethical values is a really powerful opportunity. So we're applying for funding now to expand that to synagogues and to mosques as well, and to see if we can replicate it and test it, because Texas is pretty specific place, and so we don't know if it'll be effective outside of Texas, even though evangelical churches are everywhere.
Indeed. Other questions? Other questions?
I have some.
Yeah, please.
I really like what I heard about some of the solutions that you've been working on at the lab. And I was wondering how this could apply, or if it is being applied here at AU, especially given, you know, everything that's happening.
Oh, that's a great question. We did get involved a little bit last year in the spring in the AUX2 trainings that were being done on campus. I think that, we have a large project in higher education that's funded by the Lumina Foundation that does two things. One, we have a toolkit that's free and available to anyone in higher ed called Building Resilient Inclusive Communities of Knowledge. We do a lot of trainings for higher ed, and we've done some of those here on our campus as well through the Center for Teaching, Research, and Learning, CTRL. We have an arranged marriage, as we call it, between a funder arranged it between the American Association of State Colleges and Universities and us. So ASCU is the home for all public-facing four-year institutions, and they needed content on these issues, and we needed audiences, and we have great tools. And so we now have, we go to all of their meetings. So in November, I'll go talk to 200 university presidents and share our tools. We speak to their provost meeting, their dean's meetings, their faculty meetings, and student activist meetings. So we get an opportunity. We don't have to think about how do you get people in the room. We just get to show up, and there are great people in the room who can go on and take the knowledge out. It really is I'm so proud of the funder for seeing that two groups needed each other and putting us together, because it's just a great idea. And then we heard from HBCUs and HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions, that they had a separate set of needs that were related, like they are targets of hate, but also grappling sometimes with anti-Semitism or anti-LGBTQ stuff on their own campuses. So we just finished a toolkit for Hispanic serving institutions that's available in Spanish and English on our website, and we're now moving into a new phase, hopefully in partnership, if the funder supports it, with HBCUs to do the same thing, again, in partnership with people in HBCUs as well. So it can't be just from us, it's collaborative efforts. And so, we're creating lots of tools. Some of those tools get used at AU. I think we're in a moment with a new president where there's he's in a listening phase, as he should be, to figure out what we need on campus. And I think our campus is a perfect example of how no one is immune to it. I mean, no matter what, we have had, since I've been here in 10 years, repeated swastikas, nooses, cotton stalks, misogynist flyers, anti-immigrant flyers. We've had just about every type of hate show up on campus that you can come up with. And that's not for lack of trying. I mean, it's just an example of every campus, I think. And so no one has solved it. And I would never say that we're any better at it than anyone else, because I don't think we are. I don't think we're worse, but we're not better.
Just a very, very quick follow-up. So what's the base of the toolkit that you had mentioned?
The brick
idea.
toolkit, yeah. So the brick toolkit, the first thing we did was focus groups with faculty, students, staff, and administrative leaders across the country to see, like, what do they need on this issue? And then we created responsive parts of the toolkit guidance, depending on what they needed. So, like, for example, the faculty were very clear with us. I'm laughing as a faculty member, because the faculty members were like, I want to know, what are the words that should come out of my mouth like when a student says birds aren't real, or like whatever it is in class, right? Like, so, that's a conspiracy theory that's fake, but people believe. So, that's like, so for faculty, we really have like response scripts, right? Like examples of like things you can say when you can't, you can't say certain things, but you can say, or just responses, ways to respond if someone says something, if they say something hateful, if they say something conspiratorial, if they say something promoting bad content, right? What are the things a faculty member who are not trained at all pedagogically, I will say, although most of us have opted into pedagogical training, but there's not required the way there are for teachers, certification to teach. We're certified based on our knowledge. And so pedagogically, we can kind of be a little bit in a weak spot when we hit something that we don't know how to deal with. I mean, I will say, just anecdotally, I think people have heard me say this, by far the hardest day of teaching in my entire career was the Wednesday morning after the 2016 election, when I was the first like adult that my adult students had seen, and some were crying and some were happy. And on Friday that week, we got a memo from the university that said, some of you may be struggling to to deal with like this, and here's some tips. And I thought like, well, that would have been really useful like on Wednesday morning, right? Like before 11 a.m. But so we don't get the guidance that we need often in the classroom. So we provide that kind of structure. And then for administrators, for example, we have guidance on like how to issue more effective statements. And so one of the things that I advise that our university has gotten better at, but used to be really bad at, for example, is don't lead with accountability. So we often have these statements that promise investigations, promise accountability, something bad happened, we're going to look into it. That's very unsatisfying because A, we'll never find out what happened, generally speaking, because of privacy and FERPA restrictions. Often you don't find the perpetrator anyway. It sort of just doesn't, it's not satisfying from a victim and survivor perspective, especially when it sort of says at the bottom, like, P.S. racism is bad, right? So like, it's not quite that bad, but often it's like the last thing they say is like, we stand against anti-Semitism. And so I always say like, lead with that, right? Like lead with your values, tell us what you stand for and about the incident. And then, we promise, I'd rather see PS, we promise an investigation, which we can't tell you about, but like, we're doing it. And so I think that's part of our security framework, our law enforcement framework. We will investigate, we will prosecute, we will hold these people accountable, but that doesn't make people feel better when they're feeling vulnerable or nervous or scared about their own identity group being attacked and what that means and how that affects their experience on campus and whether students feel supported. And the last thing I'll say, and I learned this from AU students, is that students have repeatedly told us at AU in surveys that when an incident happens and faculty don't mention it in class, they feel that the faculty members don't care. And faculty members, when we explained that to faculty in trainings that we did years ago on campus, faculty were surprised. They didn't know that. And they thought, well, I'm teaching physics. I don't know what to say, right? Why would I say something? And so one of the things we've encouraged faculty is even if you don't know what to say, just saying something helps. I know something happened on campus. I know some of you are upset about the nooses. We're going to keep going, but I want you to know I'm here if I can refer you to somewhere else. Like it takes a minute and a half. It makes students feel seen and heard and cared for, and that cultivates kind of social cohesion and community instead of making them feel like maybe that faculty member believes the same thing that the person who hung the nooses does. And I think that those are really important kind of just short, quick things that you can do to cultivate more community.
Do we have other questions from the audience? I want to give you a chance to wrap up, and I'm going to throw a possible question to you to think about for a moment and wrap up with, both of you really. The place we are today, are we on a spectrum? Are we on a timeline? Are we moving in a direction that, as a scholar of these movements across multicultures in different times, people make the comparison to Germany in the 20s and 30s and so forth. Your sort of closing thoughts on that. I just wanted to mention, since we do seem to have a preponderance of preachers' kids in the room today, I don't know how that is accounted for, but my preacher father took away my copy of Fred Schwartz's None Dare Call It Treason in 1964 during the Barry Goldwater campaign. Said, "What is this you're reading? Where did you get this?" And was extremely disapproving. And I must say it arrested me on several levels to have the preacher, who was also the father, be so disapproving. So I think that sort of thing can have an extraordinary effect. Does anybody else remember Fred Schwartz and None Dare Call It Treason? Right-wing propaganda of that time. Yeah.
I should
please.
say my father was a preacher. You know, preacher's kid is the phrase PK, but he was also a college chaplain for 30 years. And so that also tells you a lot about why I think about college campuses so much and about the communities that are on them. He was the college chaplain at Lafayette College for 30 years. And so I grew up basically on that campus and thinking a lot about what it takes to make a community for students and how we can make that better. So I would say, here's the data. This is my nerdy data person answering your question, which is in late 2021, the US was added to a list of backsliding democracies, as people may know, a global list that's well respected. So like any nerdy data person, the first thing I did was go look at the report and see like, well, what happens when a country gets added to that list? And it turns out that it takes on average 9 years to get off that list one way or the other. And I say one way or the other because you either get off, there's only 2 ways off that list. Your backsliding means you're in process. So you've either become a non-democratic state, right, and you've collapsed, or you're restored and you get off the list in the other direction. So 9 years on average is what we have according to the data, according to countries that backslide on their democratic criteria. And we're 3 years in. So that gives us on average 6 years left. So what I like that data point because it also says we're not going to solve this before the inauguration. We're not going to solve this like this. We want short-term solutions to prevent violence, but we actually need longer-term solutions in the medium and long term to restore democracy and to strengthen democratic resilience and improve social cohesion, which is trust and belonging and a sense of shared purpose. So, you know, that I'm more optimistic about because I am an optimist in general. And I think that we can still do it. And I think that there are people, we have evidence now of what works. We have a willingness to start to scale it up. But it's not, I mean, 6 years is also not 60 years. Like it's going to come before you know it. And that's on average. So maybe we'll be the ones who get 15. But we need to continue to keep moving that forward.
What's your generation's perspective?
Yes.
Speaking for my entire generation, no. I think that the data also shows that politically, as a country, we are not ideologically polarized to the same extent that we are effectively polarized, meaning your affect, your emotions, your ability to connect with people on political issues. And so I think that that really kind of goes hand in hand with everything that we're talking about. We are on this list of backsliding democracies, and there are things that need to be done, and that's building our social capital and our social cohesion to kind of rectify this effective polarization that we have, because politically on the issues, there are ways to see eye to eye. We're just hindered by emotions.
Thank you both. I can't thank you both enough. This has been idealization. Thank you all for being here. We'll try to share the recording of this widely, and I hope you all will do the same. Really want to thank both you, Kaitlyn, and you, Cynthia, for your time and your work, and for sharing it with us and with the Thurber Dialogues. Thank you all very much. I'm Ron Elving for the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies, signing off, and thank you. Thanks again.